A trusted pilot vanished on a routine flight. No wreckage. No body. The case was quietly closed, despite red flags investigators ignored. 15 years later, a discovery just minutes from home exposed a devastating injustice and raised a question no one was prepared to answer. Before we begin, I want you to do 3 things right now. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because the story you're about to hear is one of those cases that never fully lets go. It's a mystery that sat in silence for years, hidden in plain sight, while the truth waited just miles from where it all began. In the early 1990s, a quiet American town went to sleep believing one simple story: a routine flight, a sudden disappearance, and a pilot who vanished without a trace. No distress call. No wreckage. No answers. What followed was decades of speculation: accident, suicide, or something far darker. Families mourned without bodies. Investigators chased shadows. And the public slowly forgot. But here's the unsettling part: the official story was wrong. Years later, a discovery would shatter everything investigators thought they knew. Not in some remote wilderness, not at the bottom of the ocean, but shockingly close to home. And when the truth finally surfaced, it revealed a carefully hidden secret involving identity, deception, and a twist no one saw coming. Tonight, we're diving deep into the full timeline, every decision, every red flag, and the moment everything unraveled. Stay with me until the end, because the final reveal changes how this case should be remembered forever. On the surface, Rebecca Harlan was the last person anyone would expect to vanish without explanation. At 42, she was a seasoned private pilot based out of Bozeman, Montana, known around the local airfield as calm, meticulous, and almost painfully reliable. She wasn't flashy. She didn't take risks. And she never missed a scheduled landing. Rebecca flew small charter routes for ranch owners, surveyors, and the occasional medical transport. Aviation wasn't just her career, it was her identity. Friends described her as disciplined, emotionally reserved, and fiercely independent. She lived alone in a modest home just outside town, kept her finances clean, and followed checklists the way others followed instincts. On the morning of October 11, 1992, Rebecca prepared for what should have been a routine solo flight. The plan was simple: a short hop to deliver documents to a private airstrip less than an hour away. Weather reports showed mild winds and clear skies. There were no mechanical concerns logged. No hesitation in her voice when she radioed ground control. At 8:17 a.m., Rebecca Harlan lifted off the runway. That was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. When the plane failed to arrive, alarms didn't sound immediately. Delays happened. But as hours turned into night, concern hardened into fear. By morning, Rebecca and her aircraft had officially disappeared. By sunrise the next morning, the disappearance of Rebecca Harlan had triggered a full-scale response. Local law enforcement coordinated with the Civil Air Patrol, volunteer pilots, and ground search teams. The assumption was simple: mechanical failure or sudden weather interference had forced an emergency landing somewhere in Montana's unforgiving terrain. Search planes crisscrossed hundreds of square miles. Helicopters skimmed tree lines and riverbeds. Ground crews pushed through thick forest, scanning for wreckage, smoke, or even a single shard of metal. Every likely flight path was mapped. Every emergency frequency monitored. Nothing. No debris. No fuel slicks. No crash site. As days passed, theories began to fracture. Some believed Rebecca had gone down in the mountains, her plane swallowed by dense pine and steep ravines. Others suggested she may have clipped a river or lake, sinking without a trace. But experienced pilots quietly questioned those explanations. Rebecca's route avoided the most dangerous areas, and the weather that day had been unusually cooperative. Then came the more uncomfortable whispers. Friends admitted Rebecca had seemed distracted in the weeks leading up to the flight. A mechanic recalled her asking unusually detailed questions about fuel ranges. A coworker mentioned she'd requested copies of old flight logs. Still, without evidence, suspicion went nowhere. After 3 exhaustive weeks, the official search was suspended. Rebecca Harlan was declared missing, presumed dead. And with that, the case went silent, at least on paper. In the weeks following the suspended search, investigators turned their attention to the life Rebecca Harlan had seemingly abandoned. Her home was neat to the point of sterility. No forced entry. No packed bags. No dramatic farewell notes. At first glance, it looked like a woman who expected to return. But a closer inspection told a more complicated story. Inside a locked filing cabinet, detectives found several documents that didn't align with Rebecca's routine personality. Photocopies of her birth certificate, passport applications she never submitted, and handwritten notes listing variations of her own name. Some spelled differently, others completely altered. It was unsettling, yet still circumstantial. Her financial records raised more questions. Rebecca had quietly closed 2 savings accounts 6 months before her disappearance. The money wasn't withdrawn in a lump sum, but drained slowly, methodically. Small transfers. Cash withdrawals under reporting limits. Careful. Intentional. Friends struggled to reconcile these discoveries with the woman they thought they knew. Rebecca didn't talk about family much, but now it became clear she'd cut contact with her remaining relatives years earlier. No spouse. No children. No one pushing for answers. Even stranger was what wasn't found. Her car remained parked at the airfield. Her phone last pinged near the runway. Yet her personal laptop was missing, along with several aviation manuals she'd owned for years. Investigators began to ask a question they hadn't dared voice before. What if Rebecca Harlan didn't crash at all? What if she planned to disappear? The idea that Rebecca Harlan may have staged her own disappearance was quietly discussed, but never publicly embraced. In the early 1990s, cases of pilots vanishing intentionally were rare, and investigators were reluctant to accuse a presumed dead woman of deception without hard proof. Still, inconsistencies continued to surface. Radar data revealed something subtle but troubling. Minutes after takeoff, Rebecca's aircraft deviated slightly from its filed flight path, just enough to matter, but not enough to trigger alarms. It was a maneuver an experienced pilot could execute deliberately, staying below certain radar thresholds. To some analysts, it looked less like an emergency and more like a choice. Then there was the fuel. The aircraft carried more than required for the scheduled trip. At the time, it was written off as caution. In hindsight, it suggested extended range options. Investigators also noted Rebecca had recently renewed her pilot medical certification earlier than necessary. She'd paid cash. No explanation given. Yet without a plane, a body, or a witness, the theory collapsed under its own weight. The case lacked a motive. Rebecca wasn't fleeing debt. She wasn't wanted by law enforcement. There was no known romantic entanglement. No obvious reason to vanish. And so, officially, the case remained classified as a tragic aviation accident. Unofficially, it was filed away as something worse, an unanswered question. For nearly 15 years, Rebecca Harlan existed only as a name etched into missing persons databases, until a chance discovery would reopen the case in the most unexpected way imaginable. In the summer of 2007, nearly 15 years after Rebecca Harlan vanished, a routine land survey outside Livingston, Montana triggered a discovery that stunned investigators. A private landowner had requested a geological assessment before expanding fencing along a wooded ridge less than 12 miles from the Bozeman airfield. That's when surveyors noticed something unnatural beneath the overgrowth. Partially buried in dirt and pine needles was twisted aluminum, weathered, oxidized, and unmistakably aircraft debris. When authorities arrived, the scene defied every assumption made in 1992. The wreckage wasn't scattered violently, as expected from a high-impact crash. Instead, it appeared almost placed. The fuselage was largely intact. The wings showed controlled damage. No burn marks. No evidence of an in-flight explosion. Most shocking of all, there were no human remains. Dental records. Bone fragments. Personal effects. Nothing. The plane had gone down, yet somehow the pilot had not. Investigators confirmed the serial number within hours. It was Rebecca Harlan's aircraft. The crash site was located in an area that had been searched repeatedly years earlier. Somehow it had been missed, or deliberately hidden. As news broke, public reaction swung violently between relief and outrage. If Rebecca survived the crash, where had she gone? And why had she stayed silent for 15 years? The answer would come from a direction no one anticipated. As investigators re-examined Rebecca Harlan's life, a federal database flag quietly surfaced, one that had never triggered in 1992. A fingerprint match tied Rebecca to an identity that, on paper, should not have existed. The name was Daniel Mercer. According to records, Daniel Mercer was a man born in Idaho in 1968, with a partial employment history, a valid Social Security number, and a driver's license issued in Washington state. No criminal record. No death certificate. No red flags. Except for one impossible detail. Daniel Mercer's fingerprints matched Rebecca Harlan's exactly. The implication was staggering. Somewhere along the line, Rebecca hadn't just vanished. She'd become someone else, and that someone else was male. Investigators uncovered that the Daniel Mercer identity had been quietly active since the late 1980s, years before Rebecca disappeared. Utility bills. Rental agreements. Medical visits. All minimal, all clean. A life constructed slowly, patiently, and legally enough to avoid scrutiny. Even more disturbing was the proximity. Daniel Mercer had lived under that name less than 20 minutes from Rebecca's original home for nearly a decade. She hadn't fled across the country. She'd stayed close. The wrecked plane, investigators now believed, wasn't the end of Rebecca's life. It was the final piece of theater. A carefully controlled landing, followed by a walk away into a life already waiting. The question was no longer if she survived. It was why she chose to disappear in plain sight. With the revelation of the Daniel Mercer identity, investigators finally had a direction, and it pointed backward, not forward. They began digging into Rebecca Harlan's early life, searching for something that could justify such an extreme transformation. What they found had never surfaced during the original investigation. In the late 1970s, Rebecca, then a teenager, had testified in a sealed juvenile case involving prolonged abuse by a family member. Court records showed the case collapsed due to insufficient corroboration. The accused walked free. Rebecca was advised to move on. She never did. Psychologists consulted on the case suggested the dual identity may not have been impulsive, but adaptive. Rebecca hadn't disappeared to escape the world. She disappeared to survive it. Becoming Daniel Mercer offered anonymity, safety, and distance from a name tied to trauma. Flight logs supported the theory. Rebecca's aviation training overlapped with the earliest appearances of the Mercer identity. She was preparing long before the final flight. Even the location of the crash site made sense now. Close enough to walk away. Remote enough to sell the illusion of death. Investigators were left with an ethical dilemma. Rebecca, now Daniel, had committed fraud. But she'd also lived quietly, harmed no one, and rebuilt her life from the wreckage of another. The case was no longer just a mystery. It was a question of justice, identity, and whether disappearing was, for her, an act of escape or self-preservation. Locating Daniel Mercer should have been simple. On paper, he existed. Addresses, tax filings, employment records. But when agents attempted to find him in person, they ran into something deeply unsettling. No one remembered him. Former neighbors recalled a quiet man who kept to himself, yet none could describe his face with certainty. Employers confirmed short-term contract work but admitted Mercer avoided long-term commitments, social events, or official photographs. Even security badge images were missing or corrupted. It was as if Daniel Mercer had perfected the art of being forgettable. Surveillance footage from a rural post office offered the only confirmed image: a slender figure in a baseball cap, posture slightly hunched, deliberately avoiding cameras. Investigators noted subtle details: a familiar gait, a habitual tilt of the head, that mirrored Rebecca Harlan's mannerisms. But by the time the connection was made, Mercer had vanished. His bank accounts were closed within days. His rental unit sat empty. No forwarding address. No trail. Once again, Rebecca had slipped through the cracks, this time without a plane crash to mark her exit. Prosecutors debated charges but quietly shelved the case. Public exposure risked re-traumatizing a survivor and opening decades-old failures. Officially, authorities marked the case as resolved. Unofficially, they accepted what they couldn't change. When news of the rediscovered plane briefly reached local media, the story was carefully controlled. Authorities released only the bare minimum. The wreckage had been located, no remains were found, and the case was considered closed. There was no mention of alternate identities. No acknowledgement of survival. No public reckoning. Behind closed doors, however, the tone was very different. Internal memos revealed sharp disagreements between agencies. Some officials pushed for fraud charges, arguing that Rebecca Harlan, under any name, had manipulated federal systems and wasted public resources. Others countered that prosecution would expose institutional negligence dating back decades, including failures in handling her original abuse case. In the end, silence won. Rebecca's original missing persons file was quietly amended. Not solved. Not prosecuted. Simply archived. A footnote added. A box checked. A life reduced to administrative language. For the families of other missing pilots, the revelation was unsettling. If someone could disappear so completely and live nearby for years, how many other cases were built on assumptions instead of facts? The truth never reached national headlines. There were no documentaries. No press conferences. Just a quiet understanding among a handful of investigators that the story they'd told the public was incomplete. Rebecca Harlan was no longer missing. But the truth about her was never officially found. Rebecca Harlan was officially declared dead in 1993. A name engraved on paper. A story neatly summarized in aviation reports and missing persons registries. But the truth was far more complicated and far more human. She didn't vanish because she wanted to be chased. She didn't disappear for money, fame, or escape from responsibility. She disappeared because the system that was supposed to protect her failed long before she ever stepped into a cockpit. The plane crash wasn't a tragedy, it was a punctuation mark. The end of one identity and the beginning of another. Rebecca understood aviation, paperwork, and human blind spots well enough to exploit them. Not recklessly. Methodically. Somewhere, under a name no one is looking for, she may still be alive today, older, quieter, and finally untethered from the past that defined her. Or perhaps she vanished one last time, leaving behind no records at all. What makes this case so unsettling isn't the deception. It's how easy it was. How many assumptions investigators made. How much certainty was built without evidence. And how close the truth remained to home the entire time. Rebecca Harlan didn't disappear into the sky. She walked away, while everyone else kept looking up. If this story unsettled you, it should. Because cases like this don't just challenge what we believe about disappearances. They challenge how easily a narrative can replace the truth. For years, the story of Rebecca Harlan was reduced to a missing pilot and a presumed crash. But as you've seen tonight, the reality was far more complicated, far more deliberate, and far closer to home than anyone ever imagined. This case forces an uncomfortable question. How many missing persons aren't lost at all, just unseen? How many investigations end not because answers are found, but because time makes people stop asking? If you believe stories like this deserve to be told fully, without shortcuts or convenient conclusions, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a deep dive. Your support helps keep these cases alive and the questions open. And now I want to hear from you. Do you think Rebecca's disappearance was justified? Was it deception or survival? Should authorities have exposed the truth, or was silence the only ethical choice? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Read what others are saying. And remember, sometimes the most haunting mysteries aren't about what vanished, but what was right there all along.